Imagine a world where your reflection is not a source of pride but of dread. Where every time a neighbor comments on the clarity of your skin or the elegance of your face, it is not a compliment but an omen. Beauty, in this world, is not a gift. It is a mark, a brand that sets you apart, that paints a target across your body. For countless young boys in history, being handsome was not a blessing, but a sentence. Their only crime was being born with the face of an angel. And for that, they were taken, pulled away from the fields where they had once played, from the parents who tried in vain to shield them, from the lives they should have lived. Their beauty was transformed into currency. It was bargained, traded, and consumed by the powerful. At 12 years old, you don't know what's happening. You only know that men in fine robes are pointing at you, nodding as if you were a horse being appraised. You only know that they have chosen you. At first, you think it is an honor. Your family once said your face was a sign of fortune, that it would open doors. But as the cart wheels creak beneath you, carrying you away from the only home you've ever known, you begin to feel the truth. Beauty, for you, is a curse. We, today, live in a culture intoxicated by appearance. We spend billions on cosmetics, fashion, surgeries, all to capture fleeting perfection. Beauty, for us, unlocks opportunity, careers, admiration, influence. But what if we shifted the lens? What if we lived in a time when flawless skin was not an advantage but a liability? When a symmetrical face and soft features meant you would be stolen, catalogued, and consumed? In the ancient world, that was the reality. From the imperial harems of the Ottoman Empire to the courts of Byzantium, from Chinese palaces to the hidden chambers of wealthy merchants, beauty was a commodity in the purest, coldest sense. Boys, often peasants from the most vulnerable corners of society, were hunted, examined, and purchased. Their lives were not accidents of fate, but deliberate selections in a system that treated human beings like merchandise. These were not random kidnappings. They were systematic, calculated, refined over centuries until they became industries of exploitation. And the boys, once chosen, had little chance of escape. Their fate was sealed the moment an inspector's eyes lingered too long on their faces. If you think this sounds like the stuff of myth, you wouldn't be wrong. The ancient Greeks told the story of Ganymede, the boy so beautiful that Zeus himself descended from Olympus, transformed into an eagle, and carried him away to serve as cupbearer to the gods. To the Greeks, it was divine romance. But imagine it from Ganymede's eyes, a child abducted, forced to serve powers he could never comprehend. Myths like these mirrored real human practices, dressing abduction and servitude in the garb of poetry. Even the story of Narcissus, the boy who fell in love with his own reflection, whispers of the dangers of beauty. To be beautiful was to be cursed, to be trapped, to be vulnerable to forces far greater than yourself. Myths did not invent this fear. They reflected it. And in the centuries that followed, empires turned these fears into institutions. The process was always the same. One morning, long before sunrise, you'd hear the sound of hooves. The selectors would arrive at your village with the same calm professionalism as tax collectors. They weren't raiders. They weren't bandits. They were men of order, representing sultans and emperors. Their skill was not violence but appraisal. With eyes trained to measure, with fingers used to catalog, they scanned the faces of children as though searching for gemstones in a riverbed. And so it begins, the great machinery of selection. The systematized harvesting of beauty that stretched from empire to empire, century after century. Before we dive deeper into the forgotten stories of survival and suffering, consider this. If you lived then, if your child had the misfortune of being born with features too delicate, too luminous, how far would you go to hide them from the men who came at dawn? This is not just a story about beauty. It is a story about power. About how something we now worship could once condemn. And it is in the tension between blessing and curse that the history of these boys begins. The morning sun has barely touched the horizon when they come. At first it is only a sound, a faint rhythm of hooves striking cobblestones, the low jingle of metal clasps and coin pouches. Villagers stir uneasily in their homes. Mothers hush their children, fathers step outside and squint toward the road, already knowing what the sound means. These are not merchants passing through, nor soldiers patrolling. These are selectors. They move with a strange calmness, neither hurried nor hesitant. Their clothes mark them as agents of something larger, embroidered sashes, fine boots, rings that glint in the early light. They carry parchments and wax seals, not swords. Their weapon is authority, their art is evaluation. 4 decades they have perfected the craft of choosing, trained to see what no ordinary eye could detect, the subtle curve of a jawline, the translucence of a child's skin, the poise of someone too young to know why it matters. The villagers whisper in dread. Everyone knows what the arrival means. The selectors will take someone. It may not be your son today, but perhaps tomorrow. And each time they come, they leave behind houses quieter than before, families with absences they cannot speak about, and mothers whose tears become part of the soil itself. Today, in a small Balkan village, the boy is Mikail. He is 13 years old. His mother has always said he was blessed. Hair that catches sunlight with hints of gold, eyes bright and clear, a smile that made neighbors remark he looked more like the son of nobility than of a farmer. That blessing has now drawn attention. The selector approaches him with the same detachment one might use in examining livestock. He tilts the boy's chin to the light, runs calloused fingers across cheekbones, traces the line of his eyebrows. He pulls Mikail's lips apart and peers at his teeth, white, straight, untouched by rot, which alone makes him rare among peasant children. The man nods in approval. To Mikail's mother, the gesture feels like a blade cutting away her son's fate from her grasp. She lets out a stifled sob, silenced instantly by a guard's stern glance. Walk, the selector commands in broken Slavic, and Mikail obeys. He paces across the dirt yard, his bare feet pressing into the dust. The man studies his posture, his balance, the way his arms move naturally at his sides. Grace is as important as bone structure. A boy might be beautiful, but if he stumbled or carried himself without elegance, he would be passed over. But Mikail does not stumble. He moves with unconscious fluidity. His curse is complete. The inspection grows more intimate, more humiliating. His shirt is stripped away. The man examines his torso for scars, birthmarks, any imperfection that might lower his value. He runs his hands through Mikail's hair, checking for lice. He studies the whites of his eyes, the clarity of his voice, even the way his chest rises and falls when asked to breathe deeply. Each detail is noted on parchment. A human soul reduced to lines of ink. To Mikail, the experience is bewildering. He does not yet understand that his body has been converted into currency, that his every feature has become an investment to be appraised. But his mother knows. Every mother in the village knows. They stand in silence, watching their sons become commodities before their eyes, powerless to stop it. The selectors were not bandits. They were professionals serving the Ottoman Imperial machine, a system that rivaled even modern trafficking networks in its precision. Officially, some claimed the process was tied to the Devshirme, the levy of Christian boys trained for the elite Janissary Corps. But alongside that, and often in the shadows, ran another current, the search for boys not for military service, but for beauty, for the harems of sultans, for the pleasure of patrons who measured their wealth not only in coin and land, but in the youth they possessed. The men who carried out these selections were known as subbasilar. They moved through villages like skilled hunters. They had eyes trained to see what others overlooked, the delicate curve of a lip, the balance in a child's stride, the faint shimmer in hair that caught the morning light. Their profession was not unlike that of a jeweler, weighing and measuring gems, but the gems were living, breathing children. In the crowd, Mikail's father clenches his fists. He knows resistance is pointless. To defy the Sultan's agents is to invite ruin upon the whole family. And so he stands frozen as his son is catalogued like property. His silence is its own violence, born of fear stronger than love. To the modern ear, the word trafficking conjures images of shadows, crime, back alleys. But in this world, it is daylight, carried out openly, justified by law and custom. The difference between theft and duty is a seal stamped on parchment. Mikail's fate is sealed when the selector places a mark beside his name. The boy feels the weight of it without understanding. He is not a child anymore. He is material. His journey, one of humiliation and transformation, has only just begun. And he is not alone. In village after village, boys just like him are chosen in the same way. A pattern stretching across borders and empires, across languages and religions, but always the same story. A child stolen not by force of arms, but by the force of beauty itself. What happened to Mikail in a Balkan village was not an isolated cruelty. It was part of a pattern that spanned continents, a system so widespread it becomes clear that human societies, no matter how distant, found eerily similar ways of commodifying beauty. To walk through history is to find echoes of the same story. Children transformed into possessions, their worth measured by the symmetry of their faces or the clarity of their voices. In the palaces of China, the process took on its own refined form. The eunuch administrators, men who themselves had been remade by the palace system, presided over selections that were as ritualized as a religious ceremony. They spoke in metaphors, layering poetry over cruelty. A boy with the right eyes was said to have autumn water, clear, deep, capable of holding emotion like a lake reflecting the sky. Skin pale and luminous was compared to white jade, prized for its unblemished surface. Movements that flowed easily were described as silk in motion, a living fabric weaving beauty into every step. Even the smallest details were noted. Hands were expected to be delicate, their fingers long and supple, the nails smooth and unbroken. Feet were to be perfectly proportioned, small but not stunted, unmarked by the calluses of farm labor. And always the voice. The palace demanded boys who could speak and sing with clarity, whose tones could carry poetry into vast ceremonial halls. A voice too deep or too shrill was enough to disqualify a child, no matter how perfect his features. What strikes us today is not simply the selectiveness but the vocabulary itself. To describe a boy's eyes as autumn water, to praise his skin as jade, these words disguised cruelty as art. They allowed selectors to pretend that what they were doing was appreciation, not violation. Language became a mask, softening the brutality with metaphors borrowed from poetry. Far to the west, in Byzantium, the practice was just as systematic, but rooted in different ideals. The Byzantine court inherited the aesthetics of Greece and Rome, and with it the obsession with proportion. Selectors there, often former eunuchs who knew exactly what qualities would please their masters, measured faces like sculptors appraising marble. They sought the harmony of features celebrated in ancient statuary. A straight profile, the smooth line from forehead to nose to chin, ears placed with mathematical balance. Shoulders should be broad but not coarse, the neck long and graceful, the gait dignified yet supple. Byzantine poets called the ideal boy one who possessed the soul of a gazelle, alert, gentle, capable of moving with elegance but ultimately submissive. It was beauty not only of body but of spirit, carefully curated to serve power. The universality is what chills us most. Whether in Beijing or Constantinople, in the Ottoman Balkans or the hidden chambers of Venetian merchants, the same principles repeated themselves. Children reduced to measurements, to metaphors, to ideals carved from flesh. It was as if across cultures, humans discovered a single, sinister equation: beauty plus youth equaled possession. Age, too, was calculated. Too young, and a boy might not survive the journey or the rigors of training. Too old, and he might carry with him the spark of resistance, the stubbornness of a personality already formed. The perfect range was between 10 and 14, those fragile years when a child hovers between innocence and adulthood, when his face still carries the softness of youth but his body can be molded. Health mattered, but not in the way a farmer might value it. They were not seeking strong backs or calloused hands. Robustness was undesirable. What they wanted was fragility, a delicacy of constitution that could be shaped by diet, exercise, perfumes, and cosmetics. A boy who looked too much like a worker was useless to them. They needed boys who looked like art. Across empires, records confirm the same chilling thoroughness. Officials wrote detailed notes about each candidate, tracking not only their appearance but their temperament, their learning capacity, even their potential market value. And so the process was not chance or whimsy, it was bureaucracy. Lists and ledgers preserved the transformation of human beings into property, cold proof that this trade was no crime of impulse but an institution. And yet, beneath the ledgers and metaphors, there were human lives. We rarely hear their voices. They appear only in glimpses, in poems written by courtiers who marveled at their beauty, in the whispers of foreign travelers who saw them paraded in courts, in the silent gaps of family histories where a child was taken and never returned. From the outside, it may seem like ancient cruelty, sealed away in the past. But there is something disturbingly modern in the system's logic. It is not unlike the way our societies today still categorize, evaluate, and commodify people. Whether through modeling contracts, film editions, or social media's ruthless currency of likes and shares. The line between admiration and exploitation is thinner than we think. The Chinese called them white jade, the Byzantines likened them to statues, the Ottomans inspected them like prized horses. But beneath every metaphor was the same truth: these were children. And across empires, across centuries, the outcome was the same. Their names were erased. Their identities replaced. Their beauty, once a thing of joy to their families, was stripped from them and turned into someone else's possession. For the boys who were chosen, the moment of selection was not the end, it was the beginning of something far more terrifying. From the instant a mark was made beside their names, they ceased to exist as sons, as villagers, as children with futures of their own. They became assets, possessions, commodities waiting to be transported. The transformation began immediately. Families were often given a small payment, a handful of coins, or promises of favor from the empire. Some parents tried to believe this was a kind of honor, that their sons would serve in palaces and perhaps rise to positions of influence. But most knew the truth. No wealth could ever fill the void of a child taken. Coins did not soothe the sound of an empty bed at night, nor silence the memories of laughter that now echoed only in grief. Mothers wept in silence, their sobs muffled into sleeves as soldiers pushed them back. Fathers stood rigid, fists clenched but useless. Resistance was futile. The authority of empire pressed down heavier than any sword. To fight was to risk the destruction of one's entire household. And so the boys were surrendered, not because their parents did not love them, but because love was powerless against the machinery of power. Once separated from their homes, the boys were gathered into groups and prepared for transport. Their old clothes were stripped away, replaced with garments that marked them as property. Their names were written into ledgers, but in many cases those names would soon be discarded, replaced by new ones chosen by their masters. The erasure of identity began here, in the first hours. The journey itself was part of the conditioning. The boys were moved in small groups, often disguised as merchant caravans or bands of pilgrims. To outsiders, they were just another cluster of travelers. But within the group, they were already being broken down. Familiar dialects were forbidden. Boys who clung too tightly to one another were separated. They were introduced to the language of their destination, forced to repeat words and phrases, their mother tongues gradually pried from their lips. Isolation was the first tool of control. Removed from parents, separated from siblings, forbidden to use the names they had always known, the boys were adrift. Their sense of self loosened, and into that void, new identities could be constructed. And then came the lessons. Along dusty roads and across mountain passes, the first seeds of training were sown. They were taught how to bow, how to walk, how to keep their eyes lowered in the presence of authority. Some were drilled in basic posture, told to straighten their backs, to step lightly, to move with deliberate grace. Even their diets began to change. Richer foods were introduced, preparing their bodies for a life far removed from the coarse bread and thin stews of their villages. At night, huddled around fires, the boys whispered to one another. Some swore they would escape. Some cried until sleep claimed them. Others sat in silence, staring into the flames, already retreating into themselves. For each, the journey was not only physical but psychological. Every mile carried them further from their old lives, and every command pushed them deeper into submission. And then, at last, the palace walls would rise on the horizon. To the outside world, they were monuments of majesty, domes gleaming in sunlight, courtyards alive with fountains, tapestries embroidered in gold. To the boys, They were cages of beauty, prisons where their bodies would be polished and perfected until they no longer resembled the children who had once played in village fields. It is here that we meet Ahmad, 14 years old, standing in the shadows of a holding chamber deep beneath the imperial palace. The air is thick with incense, meant to mask the sour scent of fear that clings to every stone. Flickering oil lamps cast long shadows across walls that have seen this ritual countless times before. Ahmad's olive skin is smooth, unmarked by labor. He stands trembling, naked except for the chain around his neck, waiting to be summoned. Around him, other boys wait in similar silence. Their eyes reflect the same mixture of terror and resignation. Each knows they are no longer sons, no longer themselves. They are material waiting to be inspected. Above them, the palace glitters with feasts, music, and politics. Below, in these hidden chambers, the machinery of exploitation continues with the precision of a clock. The boys have been harvested. Now they will be catalogued, refined, and remade. The transformation is complete. They are no longer children. They are property. The chamber beneath the palace is silent except for the sound of bare feet shifting on stone. The air is heavy with incense, its sweetness almost suffocating, as though it has been burned not to purify but to conceal the odor of sweat and terror. Shadows from oil lamps flicker against the walls, bending and twisting like restless spirits. Here, in this underworld of marble and iron, the boys await their judgment. Ahmad is 14. He feels the cold stone beneath his soles, the trembling in his knees impossible to still. He stands naked in the circle of lamplight, his arms limp at his sides, his body on display. He tries to think of home, of his father's rough hands, of his mother's voice at dusk, but the memory is fading, replaced by the steady pulse of fear that consumes his chest. The door groans open. A figure enters with deliberate steps, the chief examiner. His robes whisper as he moves, silk brushing against itself, and his hands are pale, softened by privilege. His eyes, however, are anything but soft. They are sharpened by decades of cruelty, honed by the endless cataloguing of flesh. Behind him trail his assistants, each carrying parchment, instruments of measurement, and small vials of perfumed oils. It is less an inspection than a ritual. You. The examiner points, his voice echoing through the chamber. Ahmad flinches, but his feet obey before his mind can protest. He steps forward into the light, his heart pounding loud enough that he wonders if the examiner can hear it. The examination begins at his head. Fingers probe his scalp with the indifference of a horse trader at market. They tug sharply at strands of hair to test their strength. Satisfied, the examiner mutters, "Excellent. Lustrous. Will take dye well." An assistant scratches the words onto parchment, recording Ahmad's value as though listing the properties of fine fabric. The man turns Ahmad's face toward the lamp, tilting his chin one way, then another. His hands trace the cheekbones, the jawline, the slope of the nose. From his sleeve he produces a pair of calipers, cold, metallic jaws pressing against Ahmad's skin, measuring the width of his brow, the distance between his eyes. The numbers are recorded. A child reduced to geometry. "Open," the examiner commands. Ahmad parts his lips. The man peers into his mouth, prodding each tooth with a thin metal pick. The scraping against enamel sends shivers down Ahmad's spine. Straight. White. No decay. Excellent. The assistant notes it down. Teeth are currency. Imperfection means rejection. Next, the voice. The examiner presses fingers against Ahmad's throat, feeling the larynx. "Speak," he orders. Ahmad hesitates, his voice caught like a bird in a snare. The command comes sharper. "Speak. My name is Ahmad." The words break, trembling. The examiner nods. Pleasant tone. Clear. Pitch suitable. More notes. Ahmad realizes with horror that even his voice, the very sound of his identity, is no longer his own. It is an instrument to be shaped, like wood carved into a flute. The inspection continues with his skin. The examiner's hands glide across Ahmad's shoulders, chest, and arms, pinching and stretching, noting elasticity, smoothness, the absence of scars. Unblemished. Good tone. His complexion is described as exotic, but desirable. Again the words are written down, coldly detached. His hands and feet are next. Each finger is examined, bent backward, pressed until joints crack. Nails are inspected, palms studied for softness. His feet are lifted, arches measured, heels pressed. Delicate. Well-formed. No calluses. Ahmad knows the implication. His body has never known the weight of labor, and therefore it is perfectly suited for a life of ornamentation. Then comes the testing of pain. A needle pricks his skin. He jerks slightly but does not cry out. The examiner's lips curve in satisfaction. Good tolerance. Will endure training. Ahmad's stomach twists. What kind of training requires pain to be endured? Perfumed oil is rubbed into his chest, his arms. The examiner inhales, watches how the oil glistens on his skin. Absorbs well. Natural scent pleasing. To Ahmad, the touch is suffocating. To the examiner, it is simply another measurement, another number in the ledger. Commands follow one after another. Raise your hand. Kneel. Turn. Walk. Ahmad obeys, his movements studied not only for compliance but for grace. Every step is appraised, every gesture judged. In his obedience, he feels himself dissolving. He is no longer Ahmad. He is material. Around him, other boys are examined in turn. Some are rejected for scars, for crooked teeth, for hesitation that marks them as difficult to train. They weep silently as they are cast aside, not free but destined for lesser roles. Ahmad, however, is marked with the highest classification. His features, his temperament, his pain tolerance, all make him exceptional material. The phrase chills him more than any threat. At the end, a chain is placed around his neck. A metal tag dangles from it, engraved with a number and a symbol. It is no longer his name that defines him, but this tag. The sound of metal striking metal as tags are handed out fills the chamber with a grim finality. The report is written in cold, bureaucratic language. 17 examined. 14 approved. Quality high. Recommend immediate training. Children, reduced to inventory. Human souls translated into numbers on parchment. The boys file out in silence, chains clinking softly. Some cry. Some stare blankly ahead, their spirits already retreating. Ahmad walks with them, his tag heavy against his chest. He understands now. His beauty, the thing once called a gift, has condemned him. The inspection chamber is cleaned, its instruments put away. The lamps flicker low. Soon, another group of boys will be brought in. The cycle will begin again, endless, precise, merciless. In the palace above, music drifts through jeweled halls. Courtiers laugh, feast, and dance. But below, in the shadows, children are being remade into property. Silent sacrifices to beauty, chained forever by what once made them admired. When the examinations ended, when the chains clinked and the boys were led away into the labyrinth of palace corridors, their old lives disappeared. They no longer had names that meant anything. Their laughter, their dialects, their stories of childhood games in fields and riversides, all of it was erased, buried beneath new identities crafted for the pleasure of those in power. To the palace, they were not children. They were inventory. They were living ornaments. They were flesh sculpted into symbols of wealth and power. And yet, though the institutions that consumed them thrived for centuries, their traces remain. Records, cold, meticulous, survive in archives, lists of boys examined, descriptions of features, classifications of value. Poems written in ornate courts hint at them, praising eyes like autumn water, lips soft as pomegranate flesh, voices that floated like silk. These words sound beautiful, but they mask a truth darker than any silence. They are the language of possession. The legacy of these practices is not confined to the past. The systems of bureaucracy, the classifications, the cold detachment with which humans were measured and transformed into property, these echo uncomfortably into the present. We see shadows of it in modern human trafficking, where children are still evaluated, priced, and transported with the same systematic efficiency. We see it in industries that turn bodies into commodities, in the endless obsession with youth and beauty that drives markets today. History teaches us something haunting. When beauty is prized above humanity, cruelty becomes justified. Across empires, across centuries, rulers excused their practices with poetry, with law, with philosophy. The Byzantines cloaked exploitation in the language of classical harmony. The Chinese veiled it in metaphors of jade and silk. The Ottomans disguised it as imperial duty. But, at its core, it was the same machinery of dehumanization. The families left behind carried scars too. Mothers who lost their sons to the Dawn Riders lived with grief that could not be spoken aloud. Some whispered stories of curses, saying that the palaces would one day fall because of the tears of stolen children. In some villages, names of the taken boys were never uttered again, as though silence could protect their spirits from further harm. And yet, fragments of memory slipped into folklore. Songs about vanished sons, local legends of boys who walked into the horizon and never returned, tales of beauty that doomed its bearer. These fragments are small, fragile, but they are all we have of the boys themselves, their humanity breaking through the machinery of empire. To study this past is to confront a truth about ourselves. Humans, across cultures, have always had the capacity to reduce others to objects, to turn innocence into currency. But we also have the capacity to remember, to bear witness, to name what was done, and to ensure that systems of dehumanization are not allowed to flourish unchallenged. The boys were not volunteers. They were not ornaments by choice. They were children who should have grown into farmers, artisans, fathers, men who told stories at firelit tables. Instead, they became merchandise. Their beauty became their cage. Their stories whisper to us from across centuries. Beauty without humanity is not a gift. It is a curse. And unless we learn from their suffering, the cycle threatens to repeat itself in new forms, in new languages, in new markets. The palaces have crumbled. The empires have faded. But the lesson endures. Whenever we measure a person's value only by what they can provide, whenever we reduce a life to utility, we step closer to that same abyss. It is easy to see these boys as forgotten. But perhaps, by remembering them now, not as specimens or as metaphors, but as children, we undo, in some small way, the erasure that history tried to complete. Their beauty was their undoing. But their memory, fragile, haunting, incomplete, can be our reminder.